thank you all very much for attending, especially to the Plainfield Public Library for hosting these really wonderful historical seminars. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ryan Radice. I'm very excited to talk to you all about the winter of 1779 into 1800. This is when 3 regiments of the Army, under the direction of Alexander Hamilton, established a log hut city right here in Plainfield on land owned by the Vermeule family. My research into this site has led me to look back at a lot of the primary sources and the accounts from the period. So a lot of correspondence, orders, and much more. And I really have a lot to share with you about the daily lives of the soldiers who were stationed here in Plainfield for around 9 months, from October of 1799 into June of 1800. But I think before we get to the camp, it would be really helpful to first understand a little bit about this turbulent period of the late 1790s, especially our rapidly deteriorating relationship with France around 1796, and then the beginning of the Quasi-War in 1798. Really important, I think, just to have some background about these developments that were going on internationally and in the early period of our government, which lead to Alexander Hamilton effectively leading an army and then stationing 3 of these regiments in Plainfield. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So the United States in the late 1790s, it shares a lot of similarities with today. One of the greatest laments I think that we have today is how politically polarized society has become. But really, this polarization was a marked feature of our country in the late 1790s. Government at that time is divided between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Partisan newspapers are also becoming quite prominent during this period, and they're leveling all sorts of vile accusations against each other. There's a lot of political intrigue, influencing, suspicion, accusation, concerns about corruption, much as we complain about today. So I'm not sure if those are like really comforting thoughts that perhaps it's always been this way, but I digress. Anyway, one of the biggest issues that divides our country in the late 1790s is our relationship with France and Britain. Intimately tied in with this issue are competing ideas about the role of the Army and the Navy. So as the French Revolution progressed, Britain and France went to war with each other in 1793 during President Washington's administration. This divides our country along lines of pro-British and pro-French support. So the Federalists generally support the British on a spectrum of moderate to more extreme. Democratic Republicans favor the French on a spectrum. President Washington worked very hard during that period to promote neutrality. Right, so he realizes the danger to the young republic should we become embroiled in these European conflicts. American shipping during the 1790s is particularly vulnerable, and this is going to become a major issue. In 1794, Washington and Alexander Hamilton helped to develop the Jay Treaty, which normalizes trade relations with Great Britain, settles some unfinished business from the Revolution. But the French government sees actions like this, and they're increasingly viewing the United States as a hostile power. And importantly, they begin to attack American shipping with impunity, especially in the West Indies and the Caribbean. But they're also attacking merchant vessels, even right off of our own eastern seaboard, right here. So by the time that John Adams takes office as president in 1797, this situation with France continues to deteriorate. And as a quick aside, I have a picture up here on the screen of a box of what are called spoliation claims. This is from a project I was recently working on. These are in the Hartshorn family papers at the Monmouth County Historical Association. Richard Hartshorn, who these papers belong to, was a marine insurance underwriter. So he's insuring merchant vessels that are going to the West Indies, among other places. And he suffers a lot during this period. Those are all claims for ships that he was involved in that were captured by the French, the British, by the Spanish. This is a very serious issue. And to give you an idea of what it was like to be a merchant vessel going to the Caribbean, you want to talk about insurance, you would be charged a war premium if you were going to the West Indies, because they knew that there was a very good chance that your vessel would be captured, or impounded, taken into a foreign port. To give you an idea, again, between about October of 1796 and July of 1797, which is the beginning of the Quasi-War and the Americans begin to resist, France seizes more than 300 American vessels in the Caribbean and along our eastern seaboard. So it's a very serious issue. In light of this, Adams takes a more aggressive stance towards France. This involves expanding the Navy, constructing harbor defenses, and also giving defiant public speeches against France's actions. In the spring of 1798, the body which is governing France, is known as the Directory, They refused to receive American diplomats unless they apologize for Adams' comments. And the sticking point is that these diplomats have to pay a bribe of £50,000 to the Directory before they'll even negotiate with them. So this becomes known as the XYZ affair. And when news of this affair reaches our side of the Atlantic, these diplomatic dispatches are leaked. Americans become absolutely incensed. Anti-French sentiment reaches a fever pitch, and the two countries are brought ever closer to the brink of open conflict. Now, Adams then, with the support of Congress, authorizes what's known as the Quasi-War, sometimes called the half-war with France, which is a limited, undeclared war. It's fought entirely at sea. And that's really what Adams wanted. He always desired a limited naval war to protect American merchant shipping and to demonstrate American resolve. He did not want this to develop further into a war involving troops or an invasion or anything of the sort. But so then what about these troops? What about the army? What about Alexander Hamilton? Where do they fit into all this? So part of the measures that were approved by Congress to prosecute the Quasi-War include the immediate raising of 12 new army regiments, to which could have been added an additional 10,000 men, raised only in the event of like a formal declared war with France. This is really a significant step. Before this measure, the army consisted of about 4 regiments on the western frontier. They're sometimes known as the Old Army, and then these 12 new regiments become known as the New Army. So this is really a compromise, the raising of these 12 regiments. It's debated very fiercely at the time, but it's a major policy position of what we'll call the High Federalists. So High Federalists are those in the party that are further along the spectrum, more extreme in their views. They're more warlike or hawkish, so to speak. And these include men like Alexander Hamilton, Timothy Pickering, who is Secretary of State, New Jersey's own Jonathan Dayton, who was then the Speaker of the House, and James McHenry, who's Secretary of War. These men were really driven by a vision of creating a modern, standing European-style army, as well as concerns over a possible French invasion, which a lot of people took seriously, especially after the XYZ affair. And they're also driven by suspicion towards Democratic Republicans. They felt that they were a threat to the country due to their pro-French sympathies. Some really went so far as to borrow a term from the Second World War, that the Democratic Republicans would have been a fifth column in America should we go to war with France. These Democratic Republicans naturally opposed the army on the grounds that it was unnecessary. They don't really believe that a French invasion is likely. And they're worried that the army would only present opportunities for Federalist political patronage, right? So you have to think about, who's being given commissions as officers and so on and so forth. Tied in with this too are concerns about increased taxes in order to raise and fund the army. And that's something that makes this new army unpopular over the course of its existence, as we'll see towards the end. Now, President Adams himself is not totally opposed to an army in principle, though during the Quasi-War, the Navy really is his priority. What Adams is opposed to is Alexander Hamilton, and especially Hamilton being in charge of that army. There had been bad blood politically between Adams and Hamilton for a little while. Although Hamilton had returned to life as a private citizen at the end of the Washington administration, he continues to exert influence on members of the Adams administration. And this is in part because Adams maintained a number of cabinet members from Washington's administration into his own for reasons of continuity and to help unify the country. And these are men such as Timothy Pickering, who we have here as Secretary of State, Oliver Wolcott, Secretary of the Treasury, and James McHenry as Secretary of War. These are men who are very close with Hamilton, and they look to him for leadership in Federalist politics. Another sticking point is that Hamilton had tried to influence the election of 1796 to the detriment of John Adams by running an opposition candidate to him, Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina. So Adams is also highly suspicious, as many were, of Hamilton's ambitions. It wasn't exactly a secret that Hamilton had always desired to be the effective head of a grand European-style army. So when the issue of leading this new army comes up in 1798, Adams sought to mitigate Hamilton's influence. And one way to do this, and also sort of had a double effect in bringing prestige to the army and to help unify the country, Adams calls George Washington out of retirement, and he offers him the top rank of lieutenant general. However, remember that Washington is 66 years old by this point. And unfortunately, poor Washington never seems to be able to catch a break. Almost every time he's, ready and able to retire to his beloved Mount Vernon, it seems that somebody calls him out of retirement. And I think it really speaks, very highly of his character that when his country calls him, he dutifully accepts. But at his age, he realizes that the exertions of raising and directing an army are probably going to be too much for him. So the post of Inspector General of the Army then, which is the second in command, that becomes the most important post, as the Inspector General will be the one who is effectively in charge of the day-to-day operations. And Washington, unfortunately, to Adams' chagrin, he agrees to serve, but only if Hamilton is given the post of Inspector General. Washington, naturally, he trusts his old aide-de-camp from the Revolution, and the knowledge and skills that Hamilton has picked up from his time as a member of Washington's staff during the Revolution are considerable. Adams also respects Hamilton's military skills. He just really doesn't want him in this position. But unfortunately, no Hamilton as Inspector General means no Washington. So after a lot of controversy and debate, Hamilton is given the post of Inspector General in October of 1798. The end of 1798 and the first half of 1799 then are consumed with establishing recruiting structures in the states, sorting out the command structure of the army, and appointing officers who had to be politically orthodox Federalists. So there is a political element to the army, to be sure. Hamilton, as Inspector General, was in charge of supervising the recruiting service. He's in charge of much of the everyday administration of the army, and he commands all the army regiments that are north of Virginia. Those army regiments south of Virginia are placed under command of General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Now, how does a portion of this army wind up in Plainfield? Locations have to be found where these soldiers would be quartered, especially in the winter. So you've now raised a number of soldiers. What do we have to put them somewhere? We have to keep them under cover. Army regiments would have been dispersed over various regions of the country. And in our area here, we're concerned with finding winter quarters for the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th regiments. Washington, interestingly, is as early as December of 1798, he recommends that 3 regiments be quartered in the vicinity of New Brunswick. Now, there are some good reasons for this, which I'll expand on a bit as we go. One benefit was communication. This area here is sort of in the middle, so to speak. Washington was firmly committed to remain at Mount Vernon. Hamilton had made his headquarters in New York City. And then you have the Secretary of War, McHenry, is in the capital of Philadelphia. Though kind of an interesting note, Trenton sometimes becomes the temporary capital as yellow fever rages in Philadelphia. The New Brunswick area is sort of in the middle. The main routes of communication, of transport, main roads go right through New Brunswick between New York and Philadelphia. And that helps because you're trying to sort out various issues in the Army administration and everybody's in different places. So it certainly helped as far as communication was concerned. This area is also very conducive to housing troops. At this time, it's plentiful in resources and it's also rural. They wanted to keep soldiers out of the cities for a lot of obvious reasons. I think, there's a lot of opportunities to get yourself into trouble in a city if you're a soldier, and they certainly understood that. But they also didn't want to greatly impact the civilian population, cause issues. And that echoes a lot of concerns about standing armies in the early Republic, and even echoes back to issues from the Revolution, right, about quartering troops among the civilian population. So there's a bit of a parallel there. So in the summer of 1799, Hamilton begins to scout locations to house these 3 regiments. He sends Aaron Ogden of Elizabeth into the field as his scout to find these suitable locations. And a quick note about Ogden. He's a very important man in New Jersey history. He serves as a brigade major during the Revolution. He eventually becomes involved in state politics after the war and will eventually serve a term as New Jersey's governor in 1812. But at this time, Ogden is commissioned lieutenant colonel of the 11th Regiment, which is mainly made up of New Jersey men. In planning to quarter these troops then, Hamilton considers a few options, one of which was rehabilitating New Jersey's barracks that were built during the French and Indian War, and then were occupied again by British and Hessian forces in 1776 and 1777. Ogden visits these barracks, especially in Perth Amboy, but he finds them in such a state of disrepair that he advises Hamilton to change plans. So in August of 1799, Ogden visits the Vermeule property here in Plainfield, and he reports back to Hamilton that this was by far the best option, and really that building a winter cantonment here would be very advantageous. Among the features of the property that Ogden highlighted was really a plentiful supply of timber for building log huts and for using as fuel. He mentions that there's quantities of stone that could be used to construct chimneys, and also plentiful water from the Green Brook and from other springs. He also states that the land in the surrounding countryside were healthy and pleasant, and that the land around the proposed cantonment could have been made defensible in the event of an invasion. And one quick aside here, I have this is a recruiting broadside for the 11th Regiment. I've seen it on, as I mentioned, I was talking with Nancy and Sarah before this presentation. I've seen it everywhere at so many historic sites, on everything from coffee mugs to t-shirts and even a wastebasket at one time. It's often misidentified as being from the Revolution, when in fact this is actually from the Quasi-War period for Ogden's regiment. This would have been posted up near Elizabeth. They're mainly recruiting New Jersey men for the 11th. Very important too about why they situate a cantonment here in Plainfield is, again, location and communication. The main routes through the countryside between New York and Philadelphia would have passed right in front of the cantonment. I have an ad here for the Swift Shore stagecoach line, which ran between Philly and New York. And you can see some of the locations on there, which are still easily identifiable today. Present day Front Street, going through Scotch Plains, through Plainfield. It's changed course just a little bit, but that's part of that main highway through the countryside. And a good landmark to help us understand this is the Stagehouse Tavern, which still stands in downtown Scotch Plains. That would have been the overnight stop for the Swift Shore stagecoach line on its way from Philadelphia to New York. So these are really just helpful landmarks, I think, to understand these road networks in New Jersey at the end of the 18th century and why this cantonment was placed where it was. Now, by October, Ogden had successfully convinced Hamilton, and approximately 85 to 88 acres of land were purchased by the government from Cornelius and Ader Vermeule for use as a winter cantonment. This camp, generally speaking, would have been situated between West End and Clinton Avenues, and it likely included portions of Greenbrook Park as well, because that's where they're getting their water source from. I should also mention that both Cornelius and Ader were very active in the New Jersey militia during the Revolution. They were heavily involved with the militia post that was set up on their father's property, on Cornelius's property, in early 1777 during the Forage War period. So really within the course of a generation, we see Vermeule land being used for military purposes twice, which is, I think, very interesting. And we have an excellent graphic here. Big thank you to Rich Palmetier for creating these graphics. You'll see a couple more that he's produced during this presentation. And this is really helpful, I think, just to understand the placement of the camp sort of between West End and Clinton Avenues, but with Front Street, which has changed course a little bit, sort of at the front of the cantonment. Now, command of the camp is given to Lieutenant Colonel William Stephen Smith. Smith is John Adams' son-in-law. He's married to his daughter Abigail, who also goes by Nabby Adams. He is a Revolutionary War veteran. He's a colorful character in his own right, especially in the early 19th century, but that's perhaps more for another time. His appointment as head of this camp is really a compromise. President Adams wanted Smith appointed as Adjutant General of the Army, which this would have given Adams somebody that's very loyal to him in a very senior position. So naturally that's refused. And instead, to placate Adams, Smith is offered command of the winter cantonment here, as well as leading the 12th Regiment. Smith accepts this appointment, though this greatly angers Adams, who is deeply insulted over the whole affair. And all you have to do to see that, go and read some of the letters between Smith and Adams about accepting this appointment. Adams was very, very angry over the whole thing. So of these three regiments stationed here, then, we have the 11th, which is commanded by Colonel Ogden. It's mostly made up of New Jersey recruits. The 12th, which is commanded by Colonel Smith, it's mostly made up of New Yorkers. And then we have the 13th Regiment, which is commanded by Colonel Timothy Taylor. It's mainly made up of New Englanders, and they make their way here from Connecticut. These three regiments would eventually be joined by another two companies of artillerists as well. And in all, we're talking about somewhere between 1,100 to 1,500 men being stationed at this camp. I've seen some discrepancies in the numbers, so I have to speak a little bit broadly here. Though most of these regiments are really operating under strength due to low recruitment. So combined, then these three regiments are known as the Union Brigade. And then this camp here, this cantonment, becomes known as the Union Camp. So to me, one of the most interesting things to discuss about the Union Camp are the hutting practices, how the men actually sheltered themselves. Hamilton and his officers drew on precedent and from their experience during the Revolution, but they also innovate and they improve their hut designs as the winter progresses. So it's really, I think, a fascinating topic. Shelter at the Union Camp of 1799 to 1800 would have been quite different from what New Jersey militiamen had experienced in 1777 when they were stationed during the winter at the Vermeule property. Without going too much into it, those men likely would have constructed like sort of hastily improvised brush huts or shanties in order to shelter themselves from the weather. That was a pretty common mode of shelter in the New Jersey countryside during that winter. So that wouldn't have been excellent shelter. What they have at the Union Camp is far superior. So at the Union Camp, what Hamilton initially decrees is that huts be built to nearly identical specifications as those from earlier cantonments, such as Middlebrook and Morristown. What he wrote at first is that log huts should be built that are 14 by 14 feet. So this is very similar to the standardized 14 by 16 foot huts built by the Continental Army beginning at the Middlebrook cantonment, which is not far from the Vermeule property, in fact, in present-day Bridgewater. And 12 men would reside in each hut, as had been the practice during the Revolution. However, these plans were modified as the regiments begin to assess the land they'll build on. They're looking at their available timber supplies and how they can, sort of best economize space and materials. Hamilton and his officers, in the end, they found it expedient to create double huts. So they're essentially joining two of these smaller huts together. These huts, these newer ones, which are 18 by 34 feet, may also have been inspired by Revolutionary War precedent. For example, at the New Windsor cantonment of 1782-83 in New York, which is the last one of the war, the Continental Army constructed huts very similar to those found at the Union Camp. At New Windsor, the plans for these huts were actually created by then Colonel Timothy Pickering. So again, one of those men that's during the Quasi-War period as Secretary of State, very close to Hamilton. He combines at New Windsor two 16 by 18 foot huts together with a chimney on either end. More research, I think, is necessary to determine a direct connection to New Windsor, though I think it is notable that Pickering was very close to Hamilton, and also that a number of Revolutionary War veterans in the new Army leadership, a number of them probably would have experienced the New Windsor cantonment. To go a little bit further, a very good historian on this subject who's written some really excellent things about it, Dr. Stephen Elliott, he describes New Windsor as the full maturation of the Continental Army's quartering practices and sort of the log hut city, which has become so emblematic of the Revolution. So I think it makes a lot of sense, that these men are sort of building on what was during the Revolution sort of the most modern, the fully mature practice of hutting. And I think it makes a lot of sense. We can also see here some excellent plans and illustrations of what these huts may have looked like. Again, big thank you to Rich Palmetier for his work in creating these renderings and graphics. As at earlier cantonments too, these huts are going to be built at set distances in a gridlock pattern, with officers' huts and eventually hospital huts that they'll build to the rear of the cantonment, parade ground in the front, as you might expect. This plan that I have up here, this is sort of just half of the plan of the camp. This was commissioned by Colonel Smith in November. And we also have here, thanks to Rich, a really good rendering. This is based directly on that plan from Colonel Smith to give you a bit of an idea of what this camp might have looked like when it was constructed. Now, as was the case during the Revolution, the enlisted men would have largely built their own huts. Hamilton stated that competent men to use carpenter's tools would be found among the ranks, as was the case in the last war. One notable innovation, though, as they progress through the winter in their hut designs, are actually the fireplaces. Hamilton, in his correspondence, desires that Rumford fireplaces be built. So what is a Rumford fireplace? Benjamin Thompson, who also goes by the title of Count Rumford, very interesting character. He's a Massachusetts loyalist who fled to Europe during the Revolution, He eventually becomes an employee of the Bavarian government and then eventually a count of the Holy Roman Empire. But by trade, he was a physicist, and he devoted much of his work to heat and improving fireplace design. And his publications were widely read at the end of the 18th century. So again, it's sort of, who are these men being influenced by? What publications are they reading? The fireplace that he designs is much shallower. It's more efficient in its use of fuel, and it's also more effective at channeling smoke up and out of the room. Thomas Jefferson notably had Rumford fireplaces installed at Monticello. So sort of in contrast to earlier cantonments from the Revolution, Hamilton directs that his officers incorporate these Rumford fireplaces, but also with central chimneys in the middle of the building. These would have been built mainly of brick that was purchased locally. So again, a little bit different from the Revolution, where men were using fieldstone, clay, and timber. The men were largely occupied with building their huts during November and December of 1799, and there's a rush to get everybody under cover as the weather becomes more severe. Officers would have had their huts built last, which is, again, an identical practice to the Revolution, and that meant that these men had to live into tents well into December. And as it gets colder, we also see the effects of inexperience. I think in the Army, there are accounts where enlisted men, it seems, decided to light fires in their nearly completed huts. Unfortunately, they had not carried the chimneys all the way through the roof of the hut yet, and we believe that there's at least one hut that burns down because of this. So again, some of the effects of inexperience. But as the winter continues to progress, the men continue to make improvements to their huts, and these include installing glass windows, painting window sashes, lime washing the chimneys, and in some cases, we have accounts where they're even plastering the interior walls of some huts. And I think a lot of this is just due to the availability of local materials that they can get and bring into the camp. So now with the construction of this log hut city, how do the soldiers interact with the local population? What was it like to host a Union camp in your town for almost 9 months? One thing I think that we can be fairly certain of is that the arrival of some 1,100 to 1,500 men to this area was a great economic opportunity for locals. This is pretty clear, I think, from reports that locals actually built rows of stores, described as little houses, directly across the picket line from the camp. And the officers seem to be they sort of throw up their hands, and they have a huge amount of difficulty from keeping soldiers from going into these huts to purchase various things. This strikes me almost like a kind of improvised 18th century strip mall, which is like very New Jersey, but I find it very humorous. Eventually, a kind of supervised exchange was established in camp where locals could bring in goods for sale. This is going to be supervised by the officers, of course. From the records, though, we know that liquor seems to have been a frequent problem in and around camp, perhaps as one might expect. We find that there's a lot of records of court-martials, daily orders, and it suggests that the selling of liquor to troops and disorderly conduct arising from drunkenness were problems that occasionally popped up. Soldiers sometimes bartered or they sold their gear to locals in exchange for not only liquor, but other consumable items, which really bothered the officers a great deal. The camp sutlers, too. Sutlers are merchants that are attached officially to each of these regiments, and they have rights to sell them various things. The sutlers often worked with the officers to prevent locals from obtaining licenses to sell liquor in and around camp, to try to keep soldiers out of local taverns and so on and so forth. And I shouldn't say that this is entirely altruistic. The sutlers themselves also sold liquor. So I think in part they wanted to keep the market cornered, so to speak. But we do know, again, that liquor does cause problems. So they're trying to control access to it. Keeping the soldiers in camp also proves to be difficult. We do find incidents where soldiers leave camp and sometimes cause disturbances in town, and they sometimes stole from the local population. And one of the most common offenses of this kind was stealing chickens. So again, consumable items are really a hot commodity. And before I cast too much of a pall on the soldiers or their conduct in doing this, it might be a little bit understandable, which I'll discuss more. The men's rations were often not of the best quality. They were frequently, very subpar. So it might be understandable why they're leaving camp in search of, food or other consumable items. Desertion also becomes more common as time progressed. It could be severely punished. We know that at least one soldier at the Union camp who was found guilty of repeated desertion. This was his punishment. He was sentenced to 99 lashes. He had one half of his head shaved, one eyebrow shaved off, and was publicly drummed out of camp with a halter around his neck. So they did punish desertion severely, but desertion becomes pretty common in the new army, generally speaking. It becomes less and less clear as time goes on that we're actually going to be going to war with France. So that, combined with low morale, issues with pay, issues with rations, it leads a lot of men to desert over time. In the records of court martials too, we do see that there's a notable increase in the severity of discipline as the months progress. As far as what locals would have seen, surely the frequent drilling of soldiers on the camp's parade ground, and really just all the noise and the spectacle associated with the training of soldiers, would have probably attracted a great deal of attention from the local inhabitants. And perhaps the most dramatic example of this would have been the Union Brigade's commemoration of the death of George Washington. Washington passes away at Mount Vernon on December 14th of 1799. About the same time that the Union camp, they're sort of finishing constructing their huts. He passes away following a very sudden and brief illness. But his death rocks the country. It's very difficult to understate what an impact his death has on sort of the morale of the populace. He's universally respected and beloved as the commander who led the Continental Army to victory during the Revolution. He helps to pilot the young nation through the establishment of the government, and really many of the times where it seemed the whole thing could have fallen apart. President Adams orders that public commemorations take place at all military installations. And the Union camp, they hold theirs on December 26th, so right after Christmas. And we have some very interesting descriptions, really, of what took place. This event would have begun early in the morning with the firing of a cannon 16 times in quick succession. And then they would have fired a single cannon every half hour for the rest of the day until sunset. A central part of this ceremony was a mock burial of Washington. So a temporary monument was constructed, which appears to have been like a large marquee, a large tent, so to speak. And then they're going to construct a funeral bier. So not a pyre, they're not going to be burning anything. A funeral bier is sort of like a carriage or a stretcher on which would have been something to represent the remains of General George Washington, which in this case was an urn that was draped with black cloth. So what happens then, this is really consistent with other commemorations that are held, for example, in Oxford, Massachusetts, which is the winter quarters of the 14th, 15th, and 16th regiments. The regiments, then they would have formed up into a procession. They'll go parading past the funeral bier. They'll be accompanied by clergy, by columns of the local population who had turned out for this event, which appear to have been quite numerous. And all of this would have been accompanied by cannon fire and the solemn rolls of muffled drums. This funeral bier was deposited inside the temporary monument. A eulogy was delivered to all of those present. And just a quick note too about this monument. I think we discussed this a little bit at the end of the last presentation that was given by John Daniels a few weeks ago. It seems that there may have been two monuments here. One was temporary, which was erected for the ceremony, and then one which was to be erected, which was going to be permanent. We find in the correspondence of the officers that the officers wanted to erect a permanent marble monument at their own expense. Colonel Smith even composed a lengthy epitaph to be used, which is still on record at the Library of Congress. It's very interesting to read. However, I have not seen any documentation so far that suggests this permanent monument was ever built. Men report seeing drawings of it, but I'm not sure that it ever left the drawing stage. So all of this really speaks, I think, to how significant of an event Washington's death was for these men. Many of them had served with Washington in the last war. It's clear from many of the letters and the diary entries that they wrote at this time that many of them really express a genuine grief at his passing. The soldiers themselves would have worn black armbands for the next 6 months in observation of official mourning. And it's interesting to note that while they hold this commemoration in December, they also hold another commemoration, which is very, very similar to this event on the occasion of Washington's birthday. So again, there's a number of spectacles like this that locals would have witnessed, while the Union Brigade is stationed here in Plainfield. Now, while it was events like this that punctuated daily life in camp, otherwise life in camp was mostly taken up with drilling, camp chores, maintaining their huts, and so on and so forth, and also dealing with problems in provisioning and health. While the situation at the Union camp is not as desperate as it was at Morristown, say in the winter of 1779 into 80, where we have those famous descriptions from Joseph Plum Martin of soldiers eating tree bark, roasting old shoes, and even a pet dog, it appears that much of what the men received in rations and supplies was subpar. A frequent complaint among the men and among the officers are bad meat rations, and also bread that was not fully baked, which is kind of interesting. This is an accusation which is often lobbed by Colonel Smith against the baker. Bread is sold by weight. So he accuses the baker of underbaking the bread so that it has a higher moisture content. He can then sell it for more weight and make more money. So that appears to have contributed in part to low morale, just having poor quality of food. But we also find that there's a poor quality of clothing. There's often a lack of supplies, including shortages of soap, which may have also contributed to illness in camp. Most important are that water supplies became contaminated at some point during the winter. There are descriptions of the men where they cease to draw water from the Green Brook and they begin to dig regimental wells, which is really quite interesting. We know the water turned bad at some point. You find in their letters and entries, very simple, straightforward lines that the water is bad, things like that. So concerns about poor water often appear in their correspondence. Poor sanitation in camp is also a big problem. And this is interesting. In a sense, the Union Brigade repeats mistakes that were made at earlier cantonments, especially Valley Forge. The problem of men relieving themselves in places other than designated latrines contributed a lot to the spread of disease and a lot of misery at Valley Forge. And it appears that it does so again at the Union camp. In fact, at the Union camp, the situation seems to have become so severe, even within the first 2 months that the regiments are here, that anyone who was caught relieving himself anywhere else than designated latrines could receive 5 lashes on his rear end. So this was really a punishment meant to humiliate somebody and to deal with the problem quickly. The most common illnesses that we find in camp are reported as camp fevers. Camp fevers is a broad term that can refer to a variety of illnesses caused by contaminated water and food, among other things. And these become more common as the winter progresses. And it eventually necessitated the building of separate regimental hospitals in the rear of the cantonment. These would have been built by April, and they were used to isolate the sick out of the line. And this is very interesting. They had their own separate kitchens. They even had separate gardens that were planned. So they tried to keep the food supply, or at least they planned to. They planned to keep all that separate just for the sick men. Smallpox is also a concern, though this is what I found quite unique, is that the first case of smallpox is not reported until May 1st. May 1st is only a short time before the men depart camp. They're mostly gone by June of 1800, mid-June. One soldier in early May is reported to have contracted smallpox, but he was quickly isolated into this hospital system. And a letter that's dated just 2 weeks after the fact expresses the relief that smallpox had not spread to anyone else, and that the original soldier who had it survived, and in fact was on the mend. So correspondence suggests that there were men in the ranks that had already had smallpox, which perhaps if there were men that already had some degree of immunity, that may have helped to mitigate a large outbreak of disease in camp. There are also some interesting discussions in Hamilton's correspondence of inoculating the troops as early as July of 1799. And unfortunately, I don't have many more details on how that practice may have been implemented in the new army. But I think that all of this, along with Colonel Smith's hospital system, probably helped to avert a more severe outbreak of disease in camp, especially smallpox, which would have been particularly catastrophic. And while on the topic, I should also mention that reports of death are fairly low, a lot lower than I expected when I began to go back into the primary sources and look at this topic. Sylvanus Seeley, who was the 11th Regiment sutler, very colorful character again in his own right. He's worthy of a presentation all by himself. He was attached to the 11th Regiment for about a year, and he maintained a very detailed diary during that time. A lot of great incidents about camp life and what he was up to. And in his diary, he records only 5 deaths during the camp's existence. Official returns that we have from April of 1800, so a short time before the regiments depart, record only 7 deaths in the 11th Regiment, 17 in the 12th, and only 1 in the 13th. However, this tally is really for the whole period of time from when the regiment was formed to April of 1800. So it's possible that a number of these men that are listed as passing away may have passed away before they even arrived at camp. So it's a little bit hard to figure out, sort of to make sense of that figure. However, correspondence really from April and May of 1800s indicates that these officers feared that many men would sicken and die if the brigade did not depart the camp soon for other locations. So that suggests, I think, to us, looking back at this material, that there were still serious problems with supply, sanitation, and illness even towards the end of the camp's existence. But in any case, the Union Brigade, and indeed the New Army, is not long for this world. From the beginning, President Adams realizes that the best way to rid himself of the Army, and therefore Hamilton, who is now in the top position of Lieutenant General following Washington's death, a position that Adams never wanted him in to begin with, is really to make peace with France. These new Army regiments can only exist if hostilities with France continue. So it's really interesting. The American naval response during the Quasi-War shows the French that the United States are far more resolved to resist them than they had thought. The political situation in France is also very unstable. So in November of 1799, Napoleon stages a coup d'etat, and he ends the rule of the Directory. So at approximately the same time that the Union camp is being established and men are building their huts, Napoleon is overthrowing the government in France. And Adams has seen opportunities to send diplomats, to send envoys in order to try to make peace with the French and bring an end to this whole situation. So again, this is all sort of happening concurrently. And Adams does send a diplomatic mission to France about that time to try to bring an end to hostilities. And these negotiations, they were ultimately successful in November, but in sort of in anticipation that peace would be made, on May 14th of 1800, President Adams approved an act of Congress that disbands the new army. So as you might imagine, this news was crushing for Hamilton and for many of the new army's officers. And though it was crushing, I can't say it would have been completely unexpected. The army's popularity had really fallen, and it was becoming a political liability towards the end. Citizens, for one, chafed under the new taxes that were levied to support the army, even as it became more evident that hostilities with France would not last. So again, it's why are we paying these taxes to support this army when it's pretty clear that we're not, in fact, going to be going to war with France? The army also suffers a lot from negative portrayals in the media, especially in these partisan Republican newspapers. So again, some of these accusations are unfair. These newspapers are portraying the soldiers as drunks, vagabonds, murderers, all sorts of, horrible things. So it does depend sort of on what newspaper you're reading, how the new army is portrayed. And I don't want to minimize that there are in fact negative interactions between the soldiers and the civilian population. Those are highly publicized to this effect. It really causes the new army's popularity to take a hit. And so then with this devastating news, Hamilton sets off from New York City to do a final inspection of the army. And he chose to inspect the Union Brigade on May 22nd of 1800. Now, Hamilton only visits the Union camp on a few occasions. He's not here most of the time. And this is really the one period when he chooses to stay in Plainfield for an extended stay. So in May, a local home is found to accommodate him for his inspection and his entourage. And it's kind of a burning question. We actually don't know whose home he stayed in. A name has escaped us in the correspondence. So that's certainly a question that we're still working on and would certainly like an answer to. And so he arrives here, he's inspecting the troops on May 22nd, but he is not the only significant person who arrives. Adjutant General North is also present, as was First Lady Abigail Adams. Now, this is really interesting. I find it just wonderful that Abigail Adams was in attendance for this inspection. She actually visits the Union camp twice. The first time she visits is in November, as the hut building is underway, and the second time she visits is for this inspection in May. And this makes a lot of sense. She was traveling between New York and Philadelphia, so she's traveling basically right past the cantonment, and her son-in-law, Colonel Smith, is in charge of the camp, so naturally she stops to visit. And I should mention, you may be wondering, while his mother-in-law visits, where is Smith's wife? Where is Nabby Adams? And unfortunately for Smith, no matter how much he tried to convince Nabby that his hut was very comfortable, it shows up in a lot of his letters, she always managed to find an excuse. Well, the Delaware is frozen over, or the roads are bad, or what have you. So she never really joins her husband here at the camp. Both times that Abigail visits, she writes to President Adams with her observations. And for anybody who's ever read any correspondence or anything that Abigail Adams wrote, you'll know that she's a very astute observer. She calls things as she sees it, and she's a lot of fun to read. And when she's here in May, she describes the officers as being absolutely crestfallen. She also remarks that while there are some officers and men of real military talent, she echoes the observations of others that inexperience is a big problem, especially among these officers. Something interesting that she points out is that many of the officers, at least, were desperately trying to find avenues to continue on in military service. So they're looking for posts in those few regiments that will remain standing after the new Army regiments are disbanded. And what this speaks to is that one of the results of the new Army's formation is the development of an officers' corps. There's a sense of camaraderie among these men, and among them, Colonel Smith included, they seek ways that they can stay on in the Army even after those new Army regiments are dissolved. Overall, Abigail Adams was actually very impressed with how the Army performs here during the inspection, and she writes to John regretting that he could not have been at the camp to witness it. Hamilton's remarks that day were reportedly more political. Keep in mind that the next presidential election is looming at this time, and Hamilton has encouraged his men to support the Federalist ticket, though he's really not encouraging them to support Adams. He's encouraging them to support Charles C. Pinckney, who was then a general in charge of the Army regiments in the South. What's going on here is that a schism had begun in the Federalist Party. Adams made his independence from these high Federalists known by promptly dismissing a number of his cabinet in early May, including Secretary of State Timothy Pickering and Secretary of War James McHenry. And in the case of the latter gentleman, Adams brings him into his office and dresses him down and insults him before demanding his resignation. So this is sort of personal. So in addition to dismissing these cabinet members, disbanding the Army, Hamilton is not enthusiastic about a second term for John Adams. So he encourages support for Charles C. Pinckney then. And in the end, after a very contentious election, which you can read about the election of 1800, it's very interesting. It's actually Jefferson who wins the presidency, and Hamilton, I should say, plays a role in that outcome. So back to the Union camp, after reviewing the Union Brigade, Hamilton remains in Plainfield for 8 more days, and then he departs up north to inspect the Army in Massachusetts. At the Union camp, then, the final issues involved are, how to dispose of the camp, and then trying very hard to get the soldiers home in an orderly fashion. And getting them home in an orderly fashion was a real concern. Abigail Adams stated this very candidly. She stated that the officers needed to lead their men back to the place of enlistment, lest, in her words, a great number of men will be turned loose and perhaps disgrace themselves. So these regiments then departed piecemeal until mid-June, at which time very few soldiers remained in camp. And this time would have been used to settle pay and other business, and apparently even some personal scores. Sylvanus Seeley, again, the sutler to the 11th Regiment, records in his diary at least one duel taking place between 2 officers, one of whom was apparently wounded very seriously. So not everything was very calm and peaceful at the end of the Union Brigade. And then the materials that were used to construct these huts were primarily sold off to locals for repurposing. And Seeley, again, records in his diary, he's very excited about this. He was able to cover the back part of his home in Chatham with the boards that he took from his hut at the Union camp. So, many of them and some of them that were involved in the camp are even taking materials and repurposing them elsewhere. So thus really is sort of the quick demise of the Union camp and the Union Brigade. And so today I'll leave you with this, sort of to conclude, though it only existed for a short time, there are some big impacts, I think, associated with the Union camp and the new army as a whole. The biggest of these, I believe, are really the political effects. In New Jersey, for example, the Federalists begin to lose elections. In the congressional elections, New Jersey Federalists actually lost 3 out of 5 seats. Republicans begin to win for the first time in this state. And though the army had become a political liability, and it was generally unpopular towards the end, which in part contributes to some of these electoral results, events in Europe actually helped to prove to Federalists and Republicans alike that a modern professional army is necessary given the emerging warfare of the 19th century. And what I'm referring to here is the prowess displayed by Napoleon's armies at the turn of the 19th century, the capabilities of the British as well. Out of this period too, in the United States, we see the emergence of a military bureaucracy for the first time. We see an independent Navy Department and Marine Corps established for the first time. And importantly, we see too a core group of officers who made the Army their career, and they helped to carry Army leadership through the next several years. But to me, the Union camp is really a fascinating case study in raising an army in the early Republic, how it interacts with the civilian population, and also just how formative the experience of the Revolution was for a number of the commanding officers, as we can see, for example, in how they construct their huts, how they're using their experience from the Revolution and falling back on it. So in closing, I really hope that you found this discussion of a largely forgotten winter cantonment as fascinating as I do. And I really hope that this sparks a greater interest in remembering and educating others about this site and its significance for New Jersey history and its broader implications, certainly for United States history. So thank you very much. It was my pleasure to give this program, and I am more than happy to take questions.